Audience members, welcome. Think about the identities that you hold. How do they intersect with each other? Does that change one's experience? So for example, if you're a male, is that the same or different than if you're a white male or if you're a male who is a person of color? Those intersections, how does it change the messages we're sent and the experiences we have? Join us today, let's find out.
My name is John Shank. My experience comes from my work career, I guess, mostly. I'm from Ohio. I was an elementary trained educator. I became a building principal of an elementary school. I worked in a central office with curriculum and instruction, and also did some tech support services as a chief of staff. And that whole scenario was kind of handed to me by luck of birth. I happened to be born into a fairly affluent, obviously white family, with a history though of a family support system which helped each one of my uncles attend college, which meant that all of my 17 cousins and myself were pretty much second generation, highly educated people, which created more advantage. And with that, I've benefited, my children have benefited, and that's kind of who I am.
My name is Kathy Tucker. I am living in Toledo, Ohio. My introduction, I think I'm going to try and wrap it up in the idea that I view myself first and foremost as a leader in my family. I'm married with 4 children, but I refer to myself as a community leader. So I started my career in banking, and I've been in the banking industry for about 15 years. In between that, I ran a nonprofit organization. And that's where I really developed this passion and this love for uplifting our communities. And I learned a lot about how individuals that are leading in communities really should be thinking with a servant leadership mindset. And so my journey took me into corporate leadership, and I currently serve as an executive leader for a local credit union in the Toledo area. And this December, I will be graduating with a law degree from the University of Toledo College of Law. And the purpose for me going to law school is there are a lot of injustices in our systems, and I think there's a need for transparency. But most importantly, there are a lot of people in our world, in our community, that deserve an advocate. And so my hope is when I graduate law school and pass the bar, that I can use that to, again, be a community leader and a leader in the law. So that's just a little bit about me.
My name is Angel Tucker. Thank you for having me. I'm from Toledo, Ohio. My beginnings are very humble. I grew up in inner city Toledo. In doing that, of course, I saw a lot of things as a youth that you probably don't expect to see. But luckily for me, I had a mother who was very forward thinking. She was college educated. So she did things like start Block Watch. She taught me that community was first and that you need to give back more than you take. That led me on a journey to join the military. It led me on a journey after that to eventually go into law enforcement. I spent some time in law enforcement. I got to do all the cool things. I got to do the bike units, the SWAT, all things of that nature. And after my law enforcement career, when it was time to retire, I got a chance to work for the mayor of Toledo as the deputy safety director, which put us directly over police, fire, and the Save Our Community program. And when my time ended there, that allowed me a chance to actually be able to help my wife more in her career and stay home more. But in doing so, that also gave us time to start our own business. And so we will be launching in 2025 our own wine business in Toledo, where we will be manufacturing wine as well as distributing it. So basically that's kind of my third act, if you really think of it. But in it all, even in the wine business, the forefront for us, and when I say us, I mean my wife and I, is community. How does this better our community? How does this affect our community? So I think my common theme is through everything that I've done and that I've learned is that my community has always come first, And I think that's just something naturally inherent inside of me. That's just who I am, and that's my story.
I am so excited to have Angel, Kathy, and John here. I met Angel like over 10 years ago when I was presenting on my first book, Tactical Communication, and he was in the audience as an officer. We clicked and have been learning from each other ever since, which gave me the awesome access to meeting Miss Kathy and becoming friends. And then John, your wife, Judge Ballinger, did trainings in Ohio with a judicial system, got to meet your wife first, became friends, and that opened the door for us to get to know each other. All three of you have helped me on my journey of awareness and understanding, and so I'm so excited to have you and have this rich conversation. In part one, we talked about what it was like to be men in the societal system and the messages that are sent. But obviously, if you're watching, there's a difference. Both Angel and John are men, but Angel is black and John is white. And so when you go to identities, that triangle is different. How does that affect then the role of being a man? So in the intersections, when we have our identities intersect, that can change how we experience a normalized dominant identity such as male. So I'm going to open it up to you guys. What are some of the things you've become aware of that even though you're both male, because one is living in a white body and one is living in a black body, that may have changed the experience of being a male?
Yeah, that's interesting. One of the first things when I was introduced to Angel, and has always been something I've been kind of curious about, I think it was 3-4 years ago, I was watching a Netflix series on some superhero thing, and there was something about a Tulsa massacre. And it was like, oh, that's got to be fiction, right? And then so I did a little research on it, and I'm going, well, no, it's not. No, it's not. So I'm 67 years old, learning for the first time about what I consider to be a significant piece of history, and I'm curious as to why it's so late. So one of the first things I asked when I said, Angel, just curious, when and how did you learn about the Tulsa massacre? And so it was like, okay.
And you said 9.
Sure,
and how,
9.
yeah, so talk to us about that.
So growing up as a minority at 9, I knew about it because my mother taught me about it. And she was taught about it. And as a matter of fact, she handed me a book that had a little something in it about it, but it had a lot of other things throughout history too. But she always made sure that I understood these things that we weren't being taught in school. And I understood that there was a discrepancy between the history that I was learning versus the history that was really happening.
And I'm going to ask all of you, was any of us at this panel, I know the answer is no for me, taught about Tulsa in the school system? Did anyone hear it from there?
No, and unfortunately, Jody, my mother is a black woman, and I did not learn about Tulsa, Oklahoma until probably about 6 or 7 years ago when I met him.
As well, right?
Yes.
And so then audience members, same question. Are you even aware of the Tulsa, Oklahoma massacre? And if so, when? And then did you hear it from an institution or was it through family? Because remember, we talked in previous episodes, our societal system operates normalized dominant. And one of the ways we operate normalized dominant is through how we retell history. So we often tell history from a formal, educated, white, able-bodied, right, male perspective. Therefore, what happens is some really significant historical pieces get missed. And so like John, one of the things you said as a white man, you never even knew about it.
Right. Yeah. And I feel so fortunate now because there's so much rich stuff. If you take the time to go out and look at it, that's just one example. I mean, you look at the 400 Souls or by Abraham Kendley, those things are so rich, and it astounds me. I mean, I'm shocked that those things weren't taught to me earlier in some kind of an organized way. I think Maya Angelou summed it up for me. There's a quote. She says, "When will we begin to teach Black history, indigenous people's history? When is that just American history? When does that all become part of a curriculum?" And as an educator, I just find that, yeah, it's a great question. Great question. When will that happen?
I think something else you'll find, John, is that's not an isolated incident.
No.
As you see now, you done already opened your floodgates. So now as you start to research, you'll find out that Tulsa was not an isolated incident. There were actually there are books, you got over 20 different instances where whole cities and towns were either devastated or turned into lakes
Or redlined.
Or redlined.
Yeah, which is a term, again, that's a term in my vocabulary, maybe 10 years.
The redlining.
Redlining.
Yep.
Yeah, which
Yeah.
is interesting.
And it's
Yeah.
something I grew up being aware of.
Yeah.
So then you had the awareness of that growing up. How do you think that affects then you as a man, and you not having that awareness, how does that affect because you as a man? Because as a white-bodied person, I hear you saying, hey, I didn't know a lot of this history. And I hear you as a black man saying, I did know. So how does that then intersect with your race, intersect and the experience you had, intersect and affect how you are as a man?
I'm gonna be honest with you. For me, as a man, it put me on a higher alert system. To know that we could be cruising along as a family just fine, but something could devastate and then wipe out and be erased from history. It made me more cognizant of how much I need to protect my family. So my wife is sitting over here like, that explains a lot. Because there are moments where my wife is like, why are you like this? But I'm very understanding of how fragile things can really truly be. And not even 100% aware, because there are things that I haven't experienced, but I am aware that things are fragile. And if things like that can be wiped out of history for a time, you can't hide it forever. But if that can happen, then what could happen to us? What could happen to my family? So at times you get so used to wearing that mask as a minority male. I can't speak for her, you or you, but as me, you get so used to wearing a mask and understanding like, okay, I have to be a protector, I have to be dominant, but I can't be too dominant or else I'm gonna be perceived as the angry black male. So there's really this pull of the privilege of being a male in today's society, but then there's some drawback on being a minority male. So you have to learn how to balance those things. And no one else is teaching you how to do it. No one's out there saying, well, this is how you have to do it, other than other minority males. So you can't go into other rooms and really talk about it unless the conversation is invited like it is here today.
Right, right. And you and I have had this conversation, urgency of awareness. My unawareness of those situations for a good portion of my life, I think ingrained in me, everybody's having the same experience I am. You know, I work hard, I achieve, everybody else has that equal opportunity just like I do. And I lived a good share of my life believing that. And then you come to find out, wow, through awareness and through listening to other people's experiences, oh man, my experience is totally different from what you've experienced or what you've experienced or anybody. Because we all see it. I was seeing it through a very narrow personal lens. Here's what the world is, here's how it works, and it works that way for everybody.
So do you feel as a white male, you have to be on that hyper alert, that angel?
Oh, heavens no.
Right?
No.
And you don't feel yourself having to balance that then with, being a protector, but then not being too strong of a protector because then you're an angry black man, but you don't have to balance with, if you're not on heightened alert, then I assume you don't have to worry about balancing it either.
No.
Right?
No. I mean, it surprises, we've had talks about, we go into parenting. I don't know if we want to move that, but it's like, okay, when I was parenting, the police are your friend. You ever get in a situation where you're uncomfortable, go find a policeman, and by gosh, just work hard and try your best, and things are going to work out for you.
And
that's
for
how
me,
the world's going to work.
Because I became an officer. Now, I'm not clearly. I appreciate the profession, but I became an officer to be the type of officer that wasn't around when I was growing up. Because when I waved at the police, I got one finger back, and it wasn't the "you're number one" finger. Okay, because of where I grew up, cops often thought everybody that was young was either gangbanging or selling drugs. So I've been beaten up by the police. I've been embarrassed in front of everybody. I've had the police pull my pants and underwear down in front of a crowd of people searching me, you know, as a 15-year-old boy. So I've had these experiences. I've had officers tell me I can't park somewhere that clearly says on the sign there's parking. you know, and I understood at that time it was more so, what are you doing here? And you have to learn how to navigate and read between those lines, but the problem is it becomes blurred. Because then you start to wonder, well, is this what's really going on? Or am I so traumatized that now I'm starting to think every time someone responds this way, because just because you respond this way doesn't mean you have the same intention someone else did. And I have to constantly work on that and think, like, is this my trauma or is this really what's happening?
When you say this really what happened, I want to break that down. And first of all, thank you for sharing, being so honest and sharing those experiences. When you've had traumatizing experiences from police done to you, yes. Then now you have to process just that. But then every situation you step into, am I assuming that they're going to be racist towards me? And am I guarded and ready to take it? Or is this person saying that with that tone just having a bad day, quote unquote?
Correct.
And you have to try to always figure and balance that. And does any of that resonate with you?
Well, no. As I said with my kids, that's been my experience. I've always been treated with great respect and always felt heard when dealing with law enforcement. And so I just assumed.
So then the message you
so
said.
I listen to your stories and go, whoa.
Right.
You know, your head almost snaps.
Right. So the messages you sent as a parent to you have boys, to your boys is, hey, if you're in trouble, go to a police officer.
Yeah.
So then what messages, being you've always had to balance this, what messages do you send to your boys and your children?
I still send the same messages because I believe police, just like society, are like everyone else. I believe inherently anywhere from 75 to 85% of the general people want the right things. They want to do right. So I still encourage our kids. I tell them, if you see a first responder, say thank you for your service.
Yep.
My wife also encourages them to do that because until someone gives you a reason to disrespect them, there's no reason to go in assuming. Plus, I don't want to put my trauma on our kids. My mother did a really good job of not doing that to me. My mother's a whole story all by herself, what she's endured in life. She never put her trauma off on me. As a matter of fact, one time I'd been attacked twice, once by neo-Nazis, once by the Klan. People say they're not still around, they are. But I was a teenager. And I remember asking my mother as she was picking rock and glass, and I still got permanent scars from that, why didn't you tell me about this? And she said, I could tell you, and then you would carry anger based on my trauma or my words. However, life might give you something different, so I have to give you the opportunity to learn it. Then if you experience it, we can discuss it. So that's the approach I take with my kids too, because everybody isn't out here to mean you harm. And we really got to be careful. We say, I don't like being generalized as a black man, but then as a police officer, I got generalized. You know, as a man, sometimes I get generalized. I don't like how it feels, so I do my best. I'm human, but I do my best not to do that to our children.
And I would like to interject because it's something that I learned and something that I observe as well. And I think it goes to your experience. When you have, and I grew up in a rural town, and there were some minorities, but for the most part, my mother protected the minority experience. But being married to him, one of the things that you mentioned is when you begin to tell your story, because it doesn't align with your narrative and what you've experienced in life, people often say he's lying or that he's making it up, that he has a victim mentality. And that adds a whole other layer of a heightened awareness, because now people don't believe me. They think I'm lying. They're saying that I'm crying wolf. If you listen to his life story, right, and when him and I were getting ready to get married, he sat me down with this therapist and he said, tell her everything. And his therapist was like, are you sure? And he shared all of that. And I remember initially hearing that, like, all of this stuff can't have possibly happened to one person. And then being in life with him and going through life and his experiences, I am constantly astounded by the reality of the experience. And someone like you, it would be really hard to conceptualize and conceive. That's why I believe in bringing people together, because when you're side by side and you experience that with them, it becomes a reality.
And that's so powerful for our listeners is when we hear, and we talk about this, when we hear an experience that is outside of our experience, as humans, we all often react and we'll even judge that experience. So Angel and John, in the previous episode, we talked about some of the commonalities of being a male in our societal system. And one of the things you both said is that you were not questioned about how do you balance your career with raising children. And that, males often aren't questioned where females are receiving that message. But now we're talking about you're a black male, you're a white male. So how did that affect your career? Because you're both males in a career, and there are some similarities being males in careers like that, but then there's got to be some differences because of that intersectionality. So for you, what do you see some of those differences be?
Well, it's funny because there are two different sides of the spectrum I see. One, I see if someone meets my wife and hasn't met me, but they see how she's dressed, the vehicle she's driving, the neighborhood she's living in, they automatically assume she's married to a white male.
Wow.
Because the black male can't provide like that.
Now, hold up, Angel. I got to pause. For my audience members, this is the one picture phenomenon. We covered that in a previous episode. When we see that Miss Kathy here has some normalized dominant, she's educated, she's upper middle class, that zip code, then what do? We start to give her and her family all the other normalized dominant identities, including white. So assuming that she's married to a white man. Yes, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Oh, you're fine. And the other point is, in law enforcement, there are times you have to be assertive.
Absolutely.
But what I've found is that even when I was less assertive than my white counterpart, I would get pulled to the side and say, you're usually so nice and friendly. It's more intimidating when you do it. And I always wanted to push that envelope and explain why is it more intimidating. But I knew, and I didn't push it, but those were the things. So I couldn't be too assertive. And on her end, I couldn't be. There's no way you're married to a black guy because he can't be a provider. And those are real things.
Yeah. So you don't get credit for the things you have done because we do the one picture phenomenon. And then I hear you saying you have to once again balance. Balance being too assertive or being being perceived as too assertive. And why is that?
Jody, so I recently, I started getting my hair cornrowed. I'm retired now, a winemaker now. But I joked at the department that I could do this and it would still be within regulation because my hair is in a certain length when that happens. And I was told very fast, we'll figure out a way to make a rule where that won't be allowed. Now, I said it jokingly, but even that came to be intimidating. That's not all law enforcement agencies.
Right.
And I offer some cadence that, again, that's the same rule as like I said before, about 85% of the people want to do good. So I want to make sure I'm not throwing my old department under the bus by making it sound like that was the overall thing.
Right.
These were isolated
incidences, yes.
just as it is in most everyday life.
Yeah. And even though they're isolated incidences, I got to ask John, have you ever had to worry about your hair and how you wore it?
No.
Or balancing.
Only in high school, a long time ago,
Yeah,
when I had it, and it was long.
There you go. Yeah. And balancing in your career, how do you think being a white male showed up?
Well, I said I was an educator, and I'm an elementary educator, which is a field kind of like nursing that is dominated by women.
Yeah.
And in the small community I grew up, the racial percentage was not. It was pretty much predominantly white. Poverty was an issue, but it was. I felt when I applied for the principalship, which was, I think there were 8 elementary schools, and of them, I think there were 11, and the 9 of them were male principals, and again with a predominantly female teaching force.
Right.
So when I think it was much easier for me being a male in those situations. I know when you talk about discipline too, I could walk into a cafeteria that was out of control, and just by using the male voice, the deep thing, saying, hey, boom, it would shut down. Where I would watch women walk in to do that, and they had to be it was a different technique they had to use. The lights were flipped and that kind of stuff. So to get it to come down.
To get perceived as that authoritarian.
Right.
Where you were perceived as that authoritarian, but I don't hear you worrying about that you were going to get perceived as being aggressive.
No, not at all. Hey, it would, get that happening.
Yeah, and you were going to say, I'm sorry, Kathy.
Yeah, and this is why I really enjoy your podcast. I think it's important because, we're for instance, Angel's story, or even John's story, we usually stop at, well, this happened. You know, they said the conversation of, you know, you could be perceived as aggressive, but there's an entire part that happens after that, and it's the reaction that we feel. It's him grappling with the fact of, do I advocate for myself right now?
Right.
Or do I just not say anything? Because if I say anything, then I'm going to be even more ostracized. And I think, and him and I have had a lot of discussions because unfortunately this occurs regularly as a black male in the career field. And him and I would have a lot of dialogues of, okay, we probably need to sit down with your lieutenant or your supervisor. And you probably need to have a discussion with them to talk about, I know you made this comment to me earlier. I'd like to talk about that.
Right.
And that's not so much invited anymore. But there is this fear of, if I bring this up, how is this going to impact my career? How is this going to impact my career trajectory? It's a real thing, and I think pausing, as you keep saying, to say, can I have a reaction to this? And can we have a dialogue about it?
Yeah.
We need more of that.
And I think Kathy, what you just said for listeners, I think all listeners, we probably at least hold one normalized dominant identity, if not more. And when we hold a normalized dominant identity, and someone who doesn't hold the normalized dominant identity brings us their experience, are we listening? Are we hitting that pause button and really listening? And do we understand how much courage it takes that person to try to tell us that story? And like you said, that consideration, like, is it even worth trying to explain my perspective? Because number one, it might not get heard, but then it could go so far as I get retaliation. And that's a very real thing when you don't have the normalized dominant experience. That's, I think, a lot of audience members can relate who don't hold normalized dominant identities is, yeah, there's many times I just didn't bring it up because what is the point? I'm going to get labeled, or I'm not going to be listened to, or even worse, I'm going to get retaliation. And I'm going to venture, maybe as a white male, and
I've never had that experience.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was just running through my head. When have I ever felt like I couldn't go in and talk to the superintendent and hear voice a concern? Never felt like I would ever be retaliated against. Never felt like it was inappropriate for me to do that.
I think maybe another thing that I would just like to ask, right, as a white male who's been successful in your career, how would you feel, or how would you handle it if, you know, someone that was like in Angel's similar situation felt that maybe there was an interaction between the two of you and they wanted to discuss this area of race and brought it to you? And I preface that question because I know we always wonder, like, if I have that discussion or if I bring that up, how is that going to be perceived? And maybe you could clarify, like, how would you take that? You may be surprised by how someone may react.
Yeah, I can only speak for who I am now. I can't answer for the 40-year-old John, okay, because I've changed. I would find it refreshing. I would find it as an opportunity to learn. And again, to listen. And these are things that I've tried to pull from what Jody has taught me. I need to listen more and ask clarifying questions so I understand and take the judgment out of it. And I hope I would respond in those ways.
So let me add this caveat. It's one-on-one, that's different, but when people are together. So I had an issue one time where I was trying to explain to the department why the Confederate flag was so offensive to me and why I thought certain pictures should be taken down, and it wasn't me trying to change, but I was just trying to express to them the reasoning. And this has not just been in surrounding, but in others. And what I find is that when you talk to people one-on-one, they can have one response, but the minute they're back with the group,
with other people that hold their identity,
then it's, well, I don't understand what you're talking about. That's really not what this means. It doesn't matter how much proof I lay out, how much documentation, how much history, how much I show. It always comes back to well, that's not what it means to me. And I find that what it means to me, even though it's traumatizing, is less important because someone else wants it to mean something different than what it really means to them. And then you feel unimportant. And there have been a lot of times in my careers where I feel unimportant but I'm always asked behind the scenes to do the important things. Oh, I need you to do this. But it's not reciprocated on the front end. You know, no one's in the public going, man, that was a
Right.
great job that him or someone else or so and so did.
So, I'm gonna interrupt you because two
ahead.
big things you have there is, one, listeners, when we hear an experience that's outside of ours, like one-on-one, and we gain some understanding, do we have the courage then to take that new understanding back to our systems, our institutions, our work, and advocate and say, hey, you know what? This Confederate flag is very hurtful to some of our employees, and it's very meaningful to some of our employees. So how do we start to have a conversation about it and really have a rich dialogue about it without, and then I think if I'm hearing you right, your second point, without minimizing someone's experience, you know? And that's what I hear you saying is that, like, I can say I have these feelings about this Confederate flag, but when no action is taken and no conversation happens, we just send a pretty clear message that that's not important to us. Is that?
Yeah, and even on the other end, because I had advocates.
Yeah.
I had people who advocated for me, who didn't look like me. They look like you. But now you're getting retaliated against because you were the brave one to advocate for me.
Yeah.
And that's another thing that we also have to address, because you get a lot of people who are not minority who will advocate for you, but then they're ostracized just for
Bringing forth that other viewpoint.
Yeah, it encourages, and it's interesting because I don't know if I've ever been tested on that, okay? So I don't know if I have the courage or not. But it's almost like you know you have this privilege. And are you willing to step out and put that on the line? Because if you do, you might lose a little piece of that privilege. That awareness and this thought process I've had in the last, again, few years, and I don't know. I hope that I would have the courage to step across that line and take that on and be able to deal with the loss if that would occur. But I think part of that could be handled in how you handle it. I don't know that I have the skill set, or I know I didn't have it 40 years ago, to take the individual conversation. I think I'd have been open to listen to that, but I don't know if I'd had the skills to deal with it in a broader group and do it in a caring and compassionate way. May have tried, but I would need some training to have done that.
Yeah.
So it's almost like courage training.
And we've even talked about, you've said to me before, like, man, I thought I was listening back, 15, 20 years ago.
Right.
But now with my new awareness, I wasn't listening.
No.
I was like, and then you just kept it moving.
Because I was thinking how I would reply to you about the flag before I even processed it.
Before you heard about it.
I think I'm better at that now. But you're right, it's a courage issue. And, if you've never had the opportunity to step that line, I don't know how I'd react. I hope I know. I hope I would react.
And one of the other things that I've noticed that I think you can build upon is, when you get a promotion or you have an achievement or you get recognition, how people may view that as, a person of color.
So we had this friend, world-renowned geneticist, professor, all these accolades. And when I got hired at my department, I was the first and only African-American officer at my department. And for some reason, our friend felt like every time he introduced me and said, hey, this is Angel, he's the first and only officer at such and such police department, he would always feel the need to follow it up and say, and he is not an affirmative action hire. And I used to kind of look at it and I'm like, well, why does he feel the need? Now keep in mind, there was an age gap between he and I. And he came up in a different time. But he wasn't a black male. But even he understood that when people looked at me and he told them about my accomplishments, that they would assume it happened because of how I looked. They just needed to fill a quota. So even when I was in another position after that I said I had worked for, it was kind of, oh, well, they only hired you. because, you know, and I was actually told that before. Never mind I had what it took.
Right.
Never mind I worked hard just like everybody else. Never mind I took the same test you took
Right.
and scored better than you did. It didn't matter. I was only there for one reason, in some people's mind.
Right.
Not everybody.
Right.
I don't speak for other people.
Right.
But the ones that I am speaking of, I know for a fact because they said it.
Yeah. And John, have you ever worried when you got acknowledged or you got a promotion?
Never. It was always because I was well qualified and I was the right person for the job.
Because you earned it.
You bet.
Which gets back to how you then, the messages you send your children. You know, that you said, hey, just work hard and it'll all turn out, you know.
Sure.
It'll be good because that's
It always
what you,
has.
Yeah, that's what you experienced.
Mm-hmm.
And when you say that, I was laughing. I'm like, well, man, I never grew up in that world. Because I know a whole bunch of people who've worked very hard and they're still just struggling. And life is still not, you know, looking at them for all the assets and all the accomplishments they've done.
Right.
But when you've experienced that, you believe that message and you send it to your children. Yeah.
Sure you do.
And in fact, the message to us is work 3 times as hard. And what happens is that creates this unworthiness, even when you're great, that only perfection will get you equality. And that in itself is its own trauma because you're never enough.
Right. The toll of always having to be perfect. And then the toll of always balancing, oh, if I act this way, I might be perceived this way. If I do this, it might. So always balancing and then trying to balance while you're also being told you have to be perfect. Like I go back to what you said, exhausting.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know that type of exhaustion.
The balance is different because, like we talked earlier about mental health,
Yes.
I even look at that differently because we're sharing. Everyone here is sharing. But my experience in the past is when I share my experiences, I'm either lying, exaggerating, or it makes people uncomfortable.
Yeah.
And then once people get uncomfortable, then they start to inherently attack.
Yeah.
You know, it's like, oh, he's making that up, or he's trying to glorify this or glorify that, and that is not. I've been asked to be transparent, and that's something I need to work on, and now we're working on it. But when it happens...
Yeah. And so listeners, as you hear the stories that everybody's sharing, check in with your feelings. You know, how does it make us feel? Because sometimes, if we are not aware of something and we don't have that experience, we feel uncomfortable. And one of the benefits of being normalized dominant is we go through life not being uncomfortable. Right, John?
Right.
We're pretty comfortable, right?
Thank goodness for the birth lotto.
Right, yeah. And so then when you say, oh, I feel uncomfortable, but that's, for a lot of us who have normalized dominant identities, that's like a whole big new feeling and we don't like it. And then what happens is, well, I don't like this uncomfortability feeling I'm having, so let me question Angel and see, well, how did it really happen? Or let me diminish his experience. And so as we have these feelings, go back to that episode, season 1, episode 5, let's process the feelings that come up as we hear about these different experiences so that we're not diminishing, we're not denying, we're not challenging, but we're really holding space to listen. And then we can have this type of rich conversation.
John, I want to ask you, I've heard you talk about the difference between your 40-year-old self and your 70-year-old self. What could someone like myself do to get a 40-year-old you to not only listen, but to embrace the discussions that we're having here today? Because that's really what we need. We need to find out how we can get that younger audience in and get them to understand that this is not about bashing, but this is about moving the needle forward.
Wow, that's a great question. I think my 40-year-old self had a perception of the world seen through my life experiences, and that became reality to me. So I think I would say to my 40-year-old self, I'd say, you need to broaden your experiences. You need to find people that are different from yourself, that you will listen to, ask critical questions, try to understand their experience. And in each time I do that, I drop another lens that helps me see the world a little closer to reality. And then as you open yourself up to those experiences, you find people where you have to put that little courage on the line to be able to step forth, mentor and support and bring that into the broader world, so that you're dropping not only the lenses that you found, but you drop those lenses for other people. Jody, you've done that for me. You've put multiple lenses in so I have a better picture of the world. So I guess my final thing would be, don't assume that your experiences are the same for everybody, and find as many people that are not like you to be in relationship with, so you can better understand their experiences, so you have a better picture of the world.
And then create that space, take that courage,
So that
people can bring forth that experience in your institutions for themselves.
Yeah. So be trained how to do that. Because having the courage
is one
sometimes you need the skill to be able to implement the courage.
Yeah.
I love that.
And feel safe, feel not safe, because then the courage goes away, but being able to take the risk. Have enough tools to be able to take the risk.
Well, and I like what you started with, is that your 40-year-old self saw the world through your lens and thought that was reality. And it was reality for you and people like you who had your experience. But being willing to go out and talk to other folks that have different identities than yourself and say, hey, would you share some of your experience? But then really listen, because that's one thing I've always experienced with you, John, is you've always listened. Like when I talk about a different experience, he would listen, and you could just see you were like putting that lens in your, in yours to look at it differently. And so, and then taking that courage to make sure that people those experiences are showing up in our institutions and in our communities, so that we can, like you said, have rich dialogues, because that's what it's about. Is we have common identities. We talked about, you are both male, and there are things that are the same. And then at those intersections, there's going to be differences, a black male and a white male. And if we can show up and start to be aware of our experience, share that, and listen to others, what amazing things can happen.
Right, and one thing that just caught me, and I want to just mention this because I've learned this, is that it is my responsibility to go out and find those experiences. It's not your responsibility to come in and train me.
Yes.
I need to take that initiative. I need to go out and look. I need to create those relationships and make that happen.
That's very, I think listeners, that's really very important, is not to go up to Angel and go, hey Angel, teach me what it's like to be a black man. Because Angel already exhausted balancing some things, if you didn't hear, okay? But to say, Angel, I've been really realizing that as a male, I'm a white male, and that's a different experience than a black male, and here's the things I've been reading, or here's the things I've been watching, and if there's any time that you'd want to have a discussion on it, I would love it. So that way, if he's exhausted that day and doesn't have to, he can, or if he wants to, but not not putting people in the teaching role for us if they haven't offered.
That's a really good point.
You. Really good I really want to say that. Thank both of you for that, because all too often, I feel as a minority, I'm asked to solve a problem that I did not create.
Right.
Oh, there's a problem with this over here. We need you to fix it.
Right. And how many times, out listeners, do we do that? I see it play out in our institutions all the time. Whether our institution is a school system or law enforcement, but it's like all of a sudden, we're not communicating clearly with, and we're white body, and this person is black body. Oh, Angel, will you step in on this conversation? Yeah. Angel's over there going, that ain't in my job description, that ain't nothing to do. But in institutions, I have seen that often happen. And if we were doing our awareness journey and actively working on it, like you said, then we wouldn't have to put you in that position. We would feel equipped to be able to have those conversations. So listeners, hopefully today has given you some new insights, some new understandings, so that we can continue this awareness journey, that we can show up and listen to understand, not just listen to react, have these rich dialogues where all of our capacities in our community and in ourselves continue to grow. Thank you, and join us next time.